whom I acknowledge are the traditional custodians of this land on which we are meeting, and pay respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. I extend this respect to Indigenous peoples in attendance today. I'd like to welcome our panellists and MC, Alex Sloan, Andrew Leigh, Merinda Nash, Adam Verwey, Matt Grudnoff, Andrew Blyth and Katie Wilson-Woolley, who Alex will introduce further later. As UC's Sustainability Planner, I'm pleased to introduce our Sustainability Festival, Beyond the Centenary Voices for the Future. This week-long festival consists of a variety of events across a diverse array of topics. And I've left a program out the front for those of you who are interested in attending events. Some of the key events, this morning we kicked off the festival with a Property Council and University of Canberra discussion on the business value proposition of sustainability. We looked at that not just from a building perspective, but also from an academic and teaching and learning perspective, and how we engage our students and the value proposition around engaging students with the ACT government, with local businesses, and also with the faculty's operations arms and research arms on the campus to produce students and graduates who are capable and able to take their place in forging a sustainable future. We have a few keynote events that I'd like to draw to your attention, and one of those is Professor Will Stephan, who's the Director of ANU's Climate Change Institute. He will be looking at the Anthropocene. Where on earth are we going? So I think that will be a very insightful look for those of you who do not have a great deal of sustainability knowledge. He's a great speaker who's very passionate about what he does. The festival will culminate on Friday with the launch of a signpost garden. And this was one of the topics of today. The signpost garden has been a bit of an experiment in how we engage students through their coursework studies, rather than allow these things to evolve as a volunteer basis, and therefore give them a long-term value as part of the university's core facility and operations, such that they have things like organic composting bedded into them, but also teaching and learning operations as well. The garden was actually designed by university students about 18 months ago, has been reviewed and looked at by university students, and was built by university students during the winter term, studying special courses in architecture and design. It's a very unique opportunity, and those of you who are around, I would strongly encourage you to get down to the launch and have a look what the students have been able to achieve in a very limited time. Now to this afternoon's pre-election Q&A on the topic Our Sustainable Future, which will no doubt spark lively debate. To facilitate this, it is my pleasure to introduce Alex Sloan, who has kindly accepted the challenging role of MC. Alex is, of course, a well-known local personality. As presenter with 666 ABC Radio and her very busy schedule, we are very fortunate to have her MC this event. Please join me in welcoming Alex Sloan.
Thanks so much, Beth, and I'm very pleased to be your MC at this afternoon's political Q&A, Our Sustainable Future, and I've done various issues about, how could you not, about parking, about public transport, about diversity, density and infill, so this is really right up my alley. And today we are fortunate to have a number of key political candidates and business representatives who've kindly given up their time in their busy schedules to participate in this important discussion. And with this cross-section of speakers, we should hear views from many aspects, which is essential for planning for the future. There are a number of questions submitted already, which I'm going to be putting to our panel today. However, if time permits and if you want to ask questions, we'll be able to do that. We will be finishing quite sharp at 5 o'clock because a number of our speakers have engagements following this session, and I have Pilates. To introduce our panellists, let me start with Dr. Andrew Leigh, MP and Federal Member for Fraser. And prior to being elected in 2010 as the Federal Member for Fraser, Andrew was a Professor of Economics at the ANU. He has written extensively on a range of subjects, including education, taxation and social policy, and he writes regularly for the Australian Press. He holds a PhD in public policy from Harvard and having graduated from the University of Sydney with first-class honours in laws and arts. And he has previously worked as a lawyer, including a stint as associate to former High Court Justice Michael Kirby and as a principal advisor to the Australian Treasury. Andrew is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, the only parliamentarian to be a fellow of one of the 4 national academies. And in 2011, he received the Young Economist Award, a prize given every 2 years by the Economic Society of Australia to the best Australian economist under 40. Then we have, next to Andrew, Merinda Nash, who is the Liberals Senate candidate. And Merinda was born in Canberra, grew up in Canberra region, attended a school at Sutton, Lynham High and Dixon College, and she has a diverse background, having previously served as a police officer, a federal public servant, and studied commerce, science and environmental law. She currently owns a retail florist shop in a major Canberra shopping centre and is completing a PhD at ANU, researching the impacts of rising CO2 on coral reefs. As well as publishing scientific papers on this topic, Merinda is a lead author on the recent CSIRO Marine Report Card on ocean acidification. As a small business owner and as a single parent, she understands the demands of balancing work with raising a family and progressing a career. And Merinda has also been involved with community groups working to clean up our city and enjoys bushwalking at Mount Majura. Adam Verwey is the Greens candidate for Fraser, and he's also a UC alumnus, so he knows his way around here. He's lived in Canberra since arriving to study at the University of Canberra in 2001, and while studying at UC, Adam became involved in student advocacy and was elected as the president of the UC Students Association. For the last 8 years, Adam has worked for Australian Ethical Investment, where he is the Business Relationships Manager, and he believes ethical investment is a great demonstration of how we can use money to support industries and activities which benefit the environment and society, as well as providing financial rewards. Adam volunteers for a group called Cooperation in Development, which has been successful in raising funds to build and continue to support the Bangladesh-Canberra Friendship School on Bola Island. Next we have Matt Grudnoff, who's a senior economist at the Australia Institute. Matt studied economics at the University of Newcastle, and he taught economics at the university for many years before moving to Canberra to work for the Australian Bureau of Statistics. He's also worked for the Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency, and his research interests are in climate change policy and the impact of the mining boom on the economy. He teaches economics with a focus on helping people engage in public debate. Next to Matt, we have Andrew Blyth, who's the Chief Executive Officer at ACT and Region Chamber of Commerce. Andrew is the Chamber's newly appointed Chief Executive Officer, and his career to date spans politics, policy, advocacy and communication, and he's held numerous roles ranging from Ministerial Policy Advisor to the Chief of Staff, Chief Executive Company Secretary, Chairman, Company Director and Small Business Operator. Andrew was the winner of the 2012 Fulbright Professional Scholarship in Australia-US Alliance Studies, sponsored by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And through his Fulbright, Andrew spent 4 months at the University of Texas Austin researching market and policy incentives that will actively drive private sector investment and in sustainable energy development and reducing energy poverty levels. Andrew's most recent position was as Principal of Hartley, Blyth and Associates, an advisory practice specialising in government relations, business strategy and communications, established in 2011. And at the end here we have Kate Wilson-Woolley, who's the ACT Coordinator of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. Kate is a university student studying anthropology and psychology and volunteers her time to be the ACT State Coordinator for the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. She also teaches toddlers and preschoolers about science and the environment using dance with Dance Kids. And Kate has lived most of her life in Canberra and is a quietly proud Canberran, living through the consequences of climate change of Australia's last angry summer, and seeing and hearing the impacts climate change is having on people around the world has driven Kate to volunteer with AYCC, the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and do scary things like this Q&A today. It's not that scary. Please welcome them all. Give them a clap, everyone. So as I say, these questions have been submitted to me. So to start the conversation rolling, I'm going to direct the first question to Dr. Andrew Leigh, MP. And straight up is the question, In your party's opinion, what is the most critical issue concerning sustainability which must be addressed within the next term of government, and how does your party intend to tackle the issue at hand? And if you can all use the microphones because it's being recorded.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alex. Thank you, Beth, for pulling together the important panel, and thanks to my very impressive co-panellists, Merinda, Adam, Matt, Andrew and Kate. For our part, the government believes that climate change is the number one environmental issue facing Australia, and the challenge for Australia really is to decouple economic growth from carbon pollution. The carbon price does that efficiently and effectively. I think we would all share the view that climate change is happening, and a similar consensus across economists, across scientists, is that the carbon price really matters. So maintaining that carbon price is absolutely critical. If successful, then by 2020 we'll halve the energy intensity of the economy, the amount of carbon pollution per dollar of output. There's a range of other issues, Alex. I mean, the network of marine parks that's been generated is now the world's largest network of marine parks, and maintaining support for local community groups in parks conservation, and hitting the right balance between development and preservation in areas like Gungahlin matters too. But for one issue would be the carbon price.
Okay, if I go straight to Merinda Nash now for your response about what's the key issue in terms of sustainability, and what will your party do in government about that?
Thank you. So one of the key issues for sustainability is to be able to support the programs that we need to ensure we have a healthy and resilient environment into the future. So taking a bigger perspective than just looking at climate change and considering what we need to do to support the programs to address climate change. For that, we need a strong and sustainable economy. We need an economy that doesn't waste money on programs that are unnecessary. And for me personally, one of the key issues that led me to get involved was seeing the policy for the set-top boxes come out, at $300 for a set-top box. And I worked out for my flower shop, I had to sell $10,000 worth of flowers to generate that federal tax. And at that time, you could buy them for $30 down the road. And I thought about the CO2 emissions involved in that. That's 5 days trade, 2 staff commuting all day. So I think about it from a policy connectivity point of view. And as mentioned, I am a CO2 scientist and I'm familiar with the science. And our party, we agree on the science. We agree that human CO2 emissions are impacting the climate. We just disagree on the way to go about addressing it. And we fundamentally disagree on the carbon taxes as being the appropriate method. Instead, we're planning to have the emissions reduction fund, where we pay directly for emissions reductions once they have occurred. And it's a reverse auction where we start off with the cheapest emissions. And we don't mind where they come from, whether this is improving energy efficiency, whether it's developing renewables. So from our party's perspective, the first thing is to ensure we have a strong economy so we can fund these programs. And as a scientist, I'm very aware about the negative impacts that rising CO2 will have on the marine environment, which is why I spent my weekends and lunchtimes coordinating what became the CSIRO paper. One of the other practical measures we have, or will have hopefully, is the Green Army, which is a version of what used to be called the Green Corps. And we can deploy this resource out into the environment to help restore, rehabilitate environments such as riverbeds, estuaries, mangroves. So some of these coastal systems draw down CO2 directly. And these programs have the added benefit of ensuring that we have the healthiest, most resilient ecosystems we can have. So this is one of the reasons why, as a scientist, I'm quite a keen supporter of our direct action policy. Thank you.
So, and if I can just get from the other political candidate, Matt, Adam, Verwey.
Hi. Obviously for the Greens, the climate change is a number one issue that we need to address if we're to prevent the most devastating effects of climate change, and we really need to work urgently. For the Greens, no matter which of the other parties is in government after this election. We think it's really important that we maintain a price on carbon. We've already seen that emissions from electricity have already dropped by 8.6% since the introduction of a carbon price. So we think getting rid of a price on carbon is sending completely the wrong message. We also need to move away from our reliance on fossil fuels and end subsidies to fossil fuel companies. And instead we need to direct that investment into renewable energy infrastructure. We need to maintain the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which the Greens agreed to with the Labor Party in the last term of government. And we need to invest in the whole mix of renewable energy, be it sun, wind, geothermal, wave energy. And I guess the other thing is making sure we have ambitious targets around our renewable energy. The Greens are the only party with a renewable energy target that goes beyond 2020. We have a renewable energy target of 90% by 2030, and we believe that's achievable.
Okay, and if along the panel now to the non-politicians, but Matt, Andrew or Kate, did you want to give any thoughts or from what you've heard, do you want to comment? So this is about, the policies to address sustainability.
Yeah, I
Best
think,
way forward.
Yeah, so I think I really appreciate the, all the parties say that that climate change is a really important thing that we need to address. And from my point of view, I don't really mind how we do it. It just needs to be really effective and it needs to happen really fast. So I think while doing things like planting trees and that kind of thing is really brilliant, we need to also be thinking that we need to peak emissions in the next 3 years, so this election is so fundamental if we're going to really avoid 2 degrees of warming. Just being really ambitious is something that I feel can be a little bit missing, I guess.
Thanks, Alex. I think this certainly presents an opportunity for business to be successful and how to go about being successful in a low-carbon world. So that for some it's opportunity and some would find it more challenging. But I'd certainly think the cost of carbon policies and green schemes certainly need to be streamlined because they are a genuine cost to business bottom line. But if I could just bring it down to a local level, we are a car city here, and this is brought to my own personal attention recently where I was without a car. And in order for me to go from Macarthur to Barton, it's a 16-kilometre bike ride, but a bit tough in a suit. But I did catch the bus. Now, that took me an hour and a half. An hour and a half to go 16 kilometres from Macarthur to Barton for a 1 hour meeting. So 3 hours on a bus for a 1 hour meeting. I can go Murray's coach Canberra to Sydney in 3 hours. So we need to think, yes, we need to talk about our challenges and what we're doing globally, but when it comes to our everyday activities, what incentives are there for us to actually make that change, to move away, even if it was just 1 or 2 days a week from being reliant on a car? I just won't do it. But if I live in a high-rise apartment building, I've got a bus at my doorstep every 15 minutes. But I live out in the suburbs, so therefore you'll get one when we get to you. Now, I've read a report that said Action's bus service its best days are behind it. So, they can't do anything about the timetable until at least 2016. All right, so Transport 2030 paper, if you haven't read it, have a read of it. But these are just some of those practical steps that I would like to take, but I feel as though my hands are tied when it takes an hour and a half to go 16 kilometres.
And we might come back, but just in terms of if I can go to you, Matt, as the economist, Matt Grudnoff, in terms of the economic approach to climate change, to dealing with climate change. You've heard from the 3 candidates. What do you think?
Well, I think the introduction of the carbon price showed how little impact reducing emissions by only a small 5% actually had on the economy. And I think it highlights how unambitious our target was and how much of the debate around climate change is really just a scare campaign in economic terms. I think
direct action work?
Direct action, you could complement mitigation, but direct action has no capacity to go. I mean, the opposition, if they get elected, will struggle to get to 5%. You would be hard-pressed to find an economist anywhere, and Tony Abbott was asked to do so and he couldn't, that would back a plan like direct action. Certainly direct action is important. Certainly there are aspects of direct action that are useful, but as far as heavy lifting, reducing emissions, direct action simply can't do that.
Can it be done without baseline data? And do we have that?
Well, I mean, direct action's one of these funny things where you've got to think about it in that it's an incredibly labour-intensive way of doing it. So the Australia Institute did a study on how difficult it would be to introduce direct action just from a public servant point of view. So we looked at direct action, the reverse auction, is nothing new in Australia. States have been doing these things for quite a number of years. And one of the most successful reverse auction was G-Gas in New South Wales. And the best they were able to do was reduce emissions at $40 a tonne. So we've got currently got a carbon price of about $25 a tonne. So firstly, direct action is far more expensive than a carbon price. The second thing is that direct action rarely achieves the kind of emission cuts that people set out to do. So on average, if you look at the reverse auction systems that we've had in place for the last sort of 15 years, they've only produced about 18% of what they thought they were going to achieve in a reduction. And the other thing is if you're looking at reducing the full 5% with direct action, you're probably looking at, and if we break that down, say, by projects where, say, each successful project reduced emissions by 25,000 tonnes, which is an enormous amount. There's no way that you could find that many projects that could reduce it by 25,000 tonnes. That's about 28,000 projects. Now, if you assume, say, 4 failed submissions for every successful submission, you're looking at about 150,000 submissions. Now, you've got to then find public servants that will go and work out and analyse and then and follow up and make sure that the emissions were actually reduced. And 150,000 is an insanely low estimate. You're probably looking at 10 times that. So you're looking at thousands of public servants at a time when we're busily talking about cutting public servants that are going to be required to even implement this sort of scheme. So,
and a media that understands it?
Sorry?
And a media that understands it?
Yeah, absolutely. So
that can report on it?
But also with the carbon price, the way the carbon price has been introduced hasn't been great either. There's been some very, very large compensation, unnecessarily high compensation, particularly to coal-fired power generators. We had the sort of weird situation where the government was busily trying to buy brown coal-fired power stations in order to put them out of action. And at the same time, they weren't willing to shut down because they were getting such great compensation that it just wasn't worth them shutting down. Now, the idea of a carbon price is to move us away from emissions-intensive activities. Brown coal-fired power is about as emissions-intensive as you can get, and yet we're compensating these and that's keeping them open.
Okay. And probably picking up from Andrew's comments about the bus, there's a question here that I'll put, perhaps if I start again along the line, and I'll go to Andrew Leigh. As the capital of Australia, how can Canberra promote itself as a sustainable city when its design continues to be dominated by wide road corridors and car-centred design? What would you do to reverse this trend and showcase Canberra as a more people-friendly and sustainable city to the world?
It's a great paradox, isn't it, Alex? Because we're the bush capital, but yet, as Andrew noted, we use cars to a great extent, and so that has an impact on emissions. I think the ACT government's thinking around trying to improve density on major thoroughfares is important, and those Flemington Avenue developments in Gungahlin, for example, are important in terms of firstly increasing the viability of the bus network, so allowing those 15-minute services that make it quicker to get from one suburb to another than to get to Sydney. And they also, I think, ensure that people are able to have one or no car households as well. Can I just touch quickly, though, Alex,
Sure.
on one of the carbon pricing issues that's been raised? I agree entirely with what Matt has said about the challenges of direct action in the number of public servants you need for this sort of highly bureaucratic system. And one of the real challenges for the coalition is that you can either meet your budget or you can meet your emissions target. But under direct action, it's very unlikely the coalition would do both. The Greens, though, are currently opposing a reduction in the free permits provided to brown coal generators. So our proposal at the moment is to link to Europe a year earlier, and that would reduce assistance to brown coal generators by a total of around $4 billion. Our main opponents in doing that at the moment are the Greens, which I find passing strange.
I'll just go back to in terms of the whole car city issue, Merinda, if that's okay.
Sure. Okay, I agree very much with Andrew on the density issue. Walter Burley Griffin's plan for this city was designed at the time that cars were coming to the fore, but he did plan to have these high density corridors along our major transport routes, but that didn't all happen when the city was built. So now we're effectively retrofitting the city, so that's part of the problem that we have. But also to promote Canberra, and when I travel, I'm very much a Canberra advocate, but I'm never sure whether to tell people the truth in case we have so many people come here that we lose some of those fantastic aspects. But one of the big attractions of Canberra to overseas people is the amount of parkland we have. And I have a great photo that I took when I was riding my horse up Mount Majura a few years ago. And I have, it was at sunrise and I had the sun behind me. And between the horse's ears, they act as a frame, and there's a kangaroo in front of me. There's all these trees in the valley. And we see Parliament House at the end. And I tell people that about, I'm not sure, 40,000 people live below those trees. It's Watson through to Civic, and most people don't believe me that I'm sitting at the edge of the capital, and by car I'm only 10 minutes from Parliament House, and by horse 20 minutes. But just back to the sustainability, I was quite sad to see I think it's called the Better Places, the electric cars program fall over. I was quite excited when I first saw that came out. And I would like to see Canberra focus back on the potential for electric cars there. And just one of the points from a policy point of view is talking about point source pollution. And the sort of the way that the coalition policy could be applied is where point source pollution is captured. It can also be there's a whole lot of things you can do with CO2. And my own research, I work on algae, I love it, happy to talk about it for hours. But what it does is it munches up CO2. So you can design systems, so if we still have to use coal for a while, you can capture or redirect that CO2 into water tanks with algae growing, use the photosynthetic process to draw down CO2, and then use that algae either as a fertiliser, you can incorporate it into all sorts of natural processes that then entomb the photosynthetically fixed CO2. So those are the sort of, I suppose, projects that I would like to see direct action, the Emissions Reduction Fund used for as well. Okay.
Okay, and to Adam, and then again, the city. We are the city of the car, and how do you turn that around?
I mean, Canberra is a really beautiful city with a lot of national parks around. Over summer, I actually went out every single weekend into the Namadgi and Brindabellas and Tidbinbilla and did a walk, which was a beautiful way to spend a summer. But internally in Canberra, it's been designed around the car, and we put far too much money into building more and more roads rather than putting in proper public transport infrastructure. We saw huge amounts of money spent on the Gungahlin Drive extension, for instance, which probably could have put better public transport into Gungahlin, could have got them light rail started already. The Greens within the ACT government have been successful in getting a lot more funding towards bicycle paths, also getting the rapid bus service up and running. And we do have a commitment to having light rail before, or at least construction started before the end of this term of the ACT government.
Did anyone, Matt, Andrew or Kate, did you want to comment on that? Just on, I think, Andrew, you've made your point about the buses.
Yeah, I think the main thing that I see for Canberra is that like the framework of emission reduction targets is a really brilliant framework to work within, and so that all these things that we're talking about are then, like, we know like what we're aiming for. and helps just build a really efficient and sustainable city. And I guess a big part of that is the funding, and the funding for a lot of the things that, say, the ACT government just got elected for sort of isn't coming through. And so it's really important for that funding to be there to really encourage an amazing Canberra. And then another really important ingredient is like the community support for these initiatives, and to actually be able to go out and talk to the other voters, so that there is that support and encouragement for the government to actually fund these projects and have them happen.
Okay. And this is another question which gets us away from this, and I didn't write this, so what do you think of Rupert Murdoch's use of his newspapers as a basis for campaigning, i.e. for Tony Abbott in this election? Is this approach ethical? Do Australians deserve better from its news media? Andrew Leigh?
Well, Alex, as you know, Australian newspaper proprietors have, in some sense, campaigned against governments for many years. I think the Sydney Morning Herald editorialised against Labor for almost all of the elections from World War II up until the late 1970s. So it's nothing new in general terms, but it's Mr Murdoch's reach over the media that makes it a particular challenge. I gave the inaugural University of Canberra it was a Challenge Your Mind lecture in this room. Jennifer's nodding there, must be right. And that was on media, the economics of changing media, and how parliamentarians like myself should respond. And there are a bunch of changes, including the sort of proliferation of outlets, but also the concentration, and the concentration in the Australian press being some of the highest in the world. That helps populists and people who are running on negative messages. It hurts people who want to talk about complicated issues and long-run reform, and it turns out that climate change is both of those things. So it's incumbent on us, and I think all, if not almost all, of our panel are committed to doing something serious about climate change, and so these sort of conversations, I think, are an important anecdote to the sloganeering that we get too often.
Merinda?
Well, I've seen the newspapers also savage the coalition, so it does seem to work both ways. However, I think Australians, we're not so reliant on the information presented by the newspapers anymore. There's so many other ways now to access information via the internet, of course. So they don't quite have the stranglehold that they used to. I just wanted to touch on one point that Andrew mentioned, and that's about the climate change message. And I agree with him quite a bit about how some of the message has been savaged by the media. And that was actually the reason why I joined the Liberal Party and got involved in politics, because as a scientist, I was very concerned that some of the messages were being politicised and the correct information was not always being presented. So it is a problem when the media are conveying the 5-second sound bites, or the papers are trying to sell a certain message. So yes, I do agree with Andrew on that. But in summary, I just don't think that the media has the stranglehold on people's sources of information that they used to have.
Adam?
The Greens have copped it from Murdoch media for a really long time. They've been very open about it. It's a little bit nice to see others cop it as openly as we have, I guess. I guess you don't expect media not to have some bias. I mean, that's always going to happen, but at the very least you expect that what they write will be rigorously researched and at the very least factual. And I think sometimes that's missing from the Murdoch media. I think media ownership is too concentrated in Australia. In some capital cities, it still is hard to find a newspaper which isn't owned by the Murdoch press. And the Greens would like to see tighter media ownership rules. And I guess, when we talk about having access to other media, one of the things the Greens are committed to is better financing of community media. We announced a policy to have an extra $27 million provided to community media to provide for skills training and equipment and Australian content, so to help break up that reliance on Murdoch and I guess Fairfax as well.
Andrew, Blyth? I think you've got one there.
Well, Alex, I think you underestimate your reach to shape.
I didn't write the question. Just let's make that clear.
I think Australians are an intelligent lot, and it takes a lot more than a few editorials to shape people's views. And I think in almost all cases, the Australian voter gets it right.
No one else? Okay. I can open it. If anyone wanted a follow-up question, we can go there if you want to indicate for the microphone. We'll get one to you at this stage. But the next question here is one about renewable energy. And so if I can start with Andrew Leigh, can you tell us about the plans to transition towards a higher proportion of renewable energy supply mix and how will it be achieved?
Well, Alex, I thought Kate put it really well before when she said she didn't really mind how we achieved a reduction in emissions. It just needs to be effective and it needs to happen quickly. That, for me, sums up how I would like to see Australia make that transition to a low emissions future. That will invariably mean just going down the energy intensity path. So moving from brown coal to black coal to gas, to pure renewables such as wind. And so, you've seen massive changes in this area. If we go back to when federal Labor was elected, there was 7,500 Australian homes with solar PV. There's now over 1 million. Wind energy has tripled over that period, and you've seen a huge expansion of research in this area as well. It's slightly sacrilegious to say it on UC grounds, but ANU has a terrific solar research facility working in with a Chinese company, Trina, which I think captures much of how we'll deal with this, which is that most of these panels will probably be produced in countries which have a larger manufacturing base than ours. But Australia has a vital role to play in the innovation end, Merinda has said, trying to promote electric cars and right across the sustainability spectrum. But that gets driven by the carbon price so beautifully, because you don't need public servants micromanaging every decision. You just have a single price which changes behaviour right across the economy. And typically at lower cost than is predicted at the outset. At least that's the experience on past uses of emissions trading in other contexts.
Merinda?
Thanks, Andrew. We've committed to 20% renewables by 2020, and the Liberal Party, like Kate, also doesn't mind where that comes from, or the emissions. And the Emissions Reduction Fund is set up to buy emissions reductions from wherever they come, whether it's energy efficiency or renewables. We also have a plan for another 1 million solar roofs, and also to focus this on low-income or for low-income workers and people, and also community groups such as scout halls and so on. And I have to follow up from Andrew on the ANU comment. Where I'm actually doing my PhD at the moment is in physics in the electronic materials engineering section. And I have to say, being there makes me an optimist, because I see these people doing this amazing research, and I use their equipment to do my research on coral reefs. But what they're doing, this amazing nanoscale research where they can tweak the structure of a crystal at the nano level, I can't fully explain everything they do because I don't fully understand all of it, but they can also grow like nanotubes on solar cells so that it massively increases the surface area for absorption. And so I see the technology of the future when I walk into the lab and say, hey, what are you doing there? But unfortunately, because of the cuts to the tertiary sector, I'm also now seeing these researchers leave. And there is so much intellectual property that has either left this country or will leave this country because we don't support the research on a long-term scale. And I think if we could put more focus on, have a long-term approach to these programs, So researchers aren't spending a year out of every 3 years begging for funds. I think that would change the nature of our renewables development.
So what is the Coalition's policy on R&D funding and tertiary funding at that level?
Actually, I have to say I'm not across all the specific details at that level, but one of the reasons why funding was cut to the tertiary sector is because the economy is in so much trouble. So as I mentioned before, a lot of this comes back to having a sustainable economy that can afford to pay for these things. But I think we have cause to be optimistic around this area. And just quickly, I'm also a big fan of tidal. So.
Okay.
Actually, when I'm not running for Parliament, work for a company involved in environmental and ethical investment, and I actually get really frustrated when I see really great Australian research and technology go overseas to get commercialised. You know, Trina Solar, Suntech, Solar Power, these are all companies using Australian technology. On the energy efficiency side, we've got ceramic fuel cells, left Australia and went to Europe. We should be providing better support for the things we have here. We should have a renewable energy industry which is far more developed than it is. As far as transitioning to a renewable energy future, I mean, it really comes down to having a price on pollution. We need to disincentivise getting our power from fossil fuels. And we need to put far more money into financing renewable energy, whether it's sun, wind, tidal. There's a company called Carnegie Wave Energy who's actually putting commercialised power into the grid from Wave Energy in Fremantle. And there's huge potential from wave energy, or whether it's geothermal as well. And we've seen in Australian geothermal companies that they've really struggled to get ongoing funding to commercialise their energy. Yeah, so we need to finance it properly, and one of those things is ensuring that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation keeps going past the election, so that those billions of dollars committed to renewable energy projects actually make it there.
Matt, did you want to, how do we get to...
Yeah, sure. So renewable energy, people seem to be in favour of it, so am I. But I think the important thing about renewable energy is that it's been actually quite heavily responsible for the fact that our emissions have been falling. I mean, as was put by one of the panellists earlier, our emissions from electricity have dropped by about 8% since the carbon price came in. But that's not all to do with the carbon price, that's actually to do with the renewable energy target. And one of the first things I said today was that the carbon price had so much smaller impact on the economy than everybody expected. And I think the renewable energy target is a similar situation. Most of the electricity price rise has been around how we regulate electricity, in particular how we pay for poles and wires, and how we encourage electricity retailers to build, producers to build more. Very little of it's been anything to do with the RET, and I think, again, 20% is a fairly timid target. And if you wanted to reduce emissions further and you wanted to encourage renewables, a renewable energy target is a very good way of doing it because it doesn't pick winners. It doesn't say, this new technology is the way to go, and then we find out later that it was a dead end. It simply leaves it up to the market to decide, well, what's the cheapest way of providing renewable energy? And then they go out and do it. So, certainly a more ambitious renewable energy target would
Has
be a
that
good
made
place to start.
PV solar cheaper too? That approach or not?
It's tricky to say. PV solar market is a worldwide market, and to think that the Australian demand for PV solar is in some way going to majorly affect the price of PV solar is difficult to agree with. There is part of it, the installation of and the setting up of, that side of it. Certainly, the more you do, the more economies of scale you can get, and the cheaper it will come. But the actual unit price, if you like, they're produced, mostly in China, certainly overseas, and they're sort of controlled, if you like, by an international market. And I don't think Australia's demand for PV is necessarily going to change that part of the price.
Andrew, did you want to move to renewables?
I think from a practical side of things, one of the first things I looked into for our own office, we're in Deakin, was the cost of solar panels, because our electricity bill is quite big. And research out of the University of Texas shows that it takes people 9 months to actually make a final decision about going with solar. But we see a car and we buy it straight away. Or in my case, my wife saying, I love that house, do it. So for me, looking at our financial situation of the chamber, it's $35,000 to get solar on our office roof. Now, I'll save 40% off my electricity bill, and I could probably look at some financing for that, but that's still $35,000 that I have to find for a 40% saving on, I think, about $14,000 worth of electricity each year. So these are practical things. There are still some incentives in the schemes or the scheme around for us to do it, but I think I can understand why the University of Texas research shows it takes people 9 months.
So are you going to do it?
If I, well, I've just had to take a hit. If I can just speak frankly, I've just had to take a hit on being sued by a former staff member, so that might put it back a bit, but it is something that I think we should do.
Okay.
Yes, but ask me in 9 months.
Okay. Yeah, the 9 month. Yes, Kate?
Yeah, all right. So high proportion of renewable energy, I think, is quite simple. It just requires prioritising it because it's really important. It's a really important ingredient in solving the climate crisis, and investing in it. So once you prioritise it, you invest in it. It needs money to happen to get a high proportion or to go 100% renewable. And yeah, as was said before, we have the technology, and what it really needs is investment. And last year I walked with 80 other people from down in South Australia, from Port Augusta to Adelaide, which is about 300 kilometres, because Port Augusta is faced with this opportunity of replacing its coal-fired power station with either a gas plant or potentially the first solar thermal plant in Australia, which is like a baseload solar thermal plant. So that's really exciting, but the investment just isn't happening. So this community that lives there is fighting really hard to have investment and get government investment, and from Marina and from the CEFC, and it just isn't happening, which is so sad because it's such an awesome opportunity. So to get a high proportion of renewable energy, you just need to really invest in it and do it fast.
Yes, Merinda, yeah, sure.
I just want to tell a very quick story from 2008, which some of you might find surprising, because I certainly did. I attended a conference in September in Sydney, and it was the APIA conference, which is the Australian Petroleum Exploration Association or something like that. So you think it's all about oil. And I was absolutely blown away by how many presentations there were on alternative energy, renewables, using bacteria to chew up CO2 and convert it into fuels. And I came out of that incredibly positive. And the presenters were saying, we should change the name of our conference to call it the Energy Conference instead of the Petroleum Exploration Conference. But that particular week, at the beginning of the week, it was good, and by the end of the week, Lehman's had collapsed. And then what happened is that, as far as I'm aware, many of those projects, they lost their funding, they lost their finance. So even without a carbon price, these companies had worked out, he who gets there first will win financially. But then the economy collapsed, and many of those projects haven't been able to be funded since. So another note of optimism, again, because you might have worked out I am actually an optimist. So there's a lot of research going on behind the scenes. The energy companies investing their own money into coming up with solutions. So I found that I found that great, and I wanted to share that story.
Just because we're coming up just the last 10 minutes, Merinda made a comment before, and I might just go back to Andrew Blyth. She said, because the economy is in so much trouble. Is it?
Oh, only got 10 minutes.
Yeah, you've got a couple. I want to come back along the line.
So I've got a couple of economists on the table, but you would think we were bathing in economic sunshine, Alex, and the truth is we're not. If I may just speak for a second here, we had a business crisis summit last Wednesday where 200 people showed up, 130 businesses and community organisations gave up their time to come and tell us some of the challenges they're facing. Some of them quite varied. We've got about 230 pages of data to work through to then present that to the Chief Minister and the Treasurer. But I think what does concern me is we actually have the lowest business survival rate in the nation, and we've had a 40% increase in liquidations in the last 12 months. So across Australia, 44 businesses are shutting their door every day, which means people are going out of getting their jobs cut. Behind the unemployment figure here in Canberra, whilst we celebrate having the lowest, we actually have seen a drop in full-time employment in the last 12 months to June on trend. Female unemployment has actually gone from 3.2 to 3.9%, and females are the ones whose hours are getting cut, the part-time mums, if you like. So we're actually concerned about that sort of situation that we're in. No doubt the kill switch, thanks to Julia Gillard calling the election back in January, has had a major impact. Wallets have stayed in the back pocket and the purses have stayed shut. You can't legislate for confidence, but you can make sure your settings provide for a confident, if not optimistic, view of the world, but also public servants losing their jobs as well. It's happening now, and it will continue to happen if the reports are correct. So we need to diversify the ACT economy. This university needs to be producing graduates that are employable in a range of areas. I think the government town era is over. This century needs to be the private sector century. And if I can draw on my experience of being in Austin last year, the city of Austin in Texas gave Samsung $18 million to build a fabrication plant. That'll generate $4 billion worth of economic activity. So for me, this is something that I'll be taking up. In fact, I came straight from a meeting with the Chief Minister and Treasurer to be here this afternoon, and I've put that on the table, that $10 million for business development is not enough. We spend $40 million on tourism and events, and we spend 0.02% of the ACT budget on business development. It's not all the government's fault, of course, that business actually needs to look at its own models. It needs to make sure that it can compete. It needs to think that this is actually a region of 600,000 people, not just the ones who live inside our border. But the fact is we're only a short drive away from 2 million people in Western Sydney whose GDP is larger than Singapore's.
So if I can get a response first from Andrew Leigh.
So if you look around the globe, we've just had the biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression. Europe's economy is smaller than it was in 2007, and 28 million jobs have been lost worldwide. It's pretty hard, in fact, to find a developed country whose economy is performing as well as Australia's. That said, we're going through a clear transition with the end of the mining investment boom, and the change in the economy means you need to think about supporting jobs through education and infrastructure. This is, I think, the last time you'd want to go for savage austerity, but that's what the coalition is promising. So cutting out 12 to 20,000 more jobs, take any decision that Labor has made, the coalition on top of that is making 12 to 20,000 additional job cuts, and of course cutting back on things like assistance to manufacturing. So if Andrew is keen on getting more industry assistance, he certainly won't get that in an era of straightened austerity under the coalition. Universities, I think, will also have a much rougher time if the coalition's elected. We've increased university funding 73% our time in office. So when you hear conversations about the 2% efficiency dividend, it's worth bearing in mind that on our current growth path, that's about 4 months' growth in funding for universities. And of course, Merinda's clean tech colleagues will suffer with the loss of a $10 billion clean energy finance corporation if the coalition ever win office. But I do want to end on a note of optimism. I have some favourite Conservatives. I'm debating on radio this evening Malcolm Turnbull, and then at a different station Arthur Sinodinos. But I do really love the prospect of Merinda in the same party room as Dennis Jensen, who believes that the Bureau of Meteorology got it wrong when they said this was the hottest summer on record. I think that would be a fascinating conversation to be a fly on the wall for. This might be my last contribution, so thank you all for a really stimulating conversation.
Merinda, did you want to?
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, I wouldn't mind having that conversation. Andrew talked about the global, how we're placed compared to the globe. I want to take you to very, very local. And I've spoken mostly about my science background here this afternoon, but my time in science has been fully funded by my retail business, a flower shop. And that supported myself, my son, a dog and a mortgage over the last 10 or 12 years. And let me tell you, in retail, especially being in Westfield, that's no mean feat. And if you think government politics is hard, try talking with Westfield sometime. But just on that, now Andrew mentioned some of the concerns in the economy. Where I stand in my shop in Woden Plaza and I look around at the traders, I know, because I've spoken to them, that 50% of them are considering closing their businesses within the next 12 to 18 months when their leases come up. Because their trade has either gone down that bit, and especially when the election was announced, that just put the brakes on amazingly. But also the back-end costs are coming up so quickly. So a lot of businesses that look like they're doing well and have been doing well in providing employment, those people are starting to consider closing because they know that in 2 to 3 years, not only won't they be making a profit, they'll probably be starting to lose money. We're already seeing the effects of local job cuts. I'm not sure how many thousands it's been, but I know it's easier now for me to get staff than it has ever been in the last 10 years. So again, on a note of optimism, I'm actually opening another shop in 3 or 4 weeks, which unfortunately looks like it's going to coincide with the election. And that's in another shopping centre where landlords are finally accepting the reality that they can't treat small businesses like magic puddings. So when it comes to an economy in transition, there's a whole lot of different parts of this economy that have to transition. And that includes the expectations of landlords and companies of the returns that they can get from small business. And also, if this is my last contribution, thank you very much, everyone.
And Adam. We might wrap it with Adam.
I'll keep it quick there. The Greens are the only party going into this election not promising lots of job cuts to the public service. So if you're concerned about the ACT economy, then the Greens might be a good choice for you.
Matt, did you? I don't
On the
want
economy, I agree that the Australian economy is suffering challenges, and I also agree that internationally we're doing extremely well. What I find most interesting about both the major parties' attitude to this at the moment is they'll both say that, and in the same breath they'll tell you that we need a surplus. Now, speaking as an economist, I cannot understand why the Australian economy needs a surplus at this particular point in time. You'd be hard-pressed to find any professional economist who would agree with that. It seems to be something that the political class has got very, very excited about, but certainly beyond the political class, there doesn't seem to be much support at all, or certainly there's no logical reason why you would need to have a surplus at this particular point in the business cycle.
Last word.
This city does well when there's a surplus. That's all I'll say, Alex.
Okay. Let's thank all the panel for coming along today. Thanks to you too, and to Dr. Andrew Leigh, Merinda Nash, Adam Verwey, Matt Grudnoff, Andrew Blyth and Kate Wilson-Woolley. And thanks from me.